So we're fortunate enough to have an opportunity to be in conversation with Bret and it's really a great pleasure, and I'm very excited about it because what we'll really be focusing on is Bret's brand new book, which I'm not doing a very good job of showing you there, but the book is entitled Psychosis in Extreme States, an Ethic for Treatment. And the book really is, I think, a new, important, indeed crucial contribution to thinking treatment, thinking the ethics, the conceptualization of psychosis, particularly from a Lacanian standpoint, but not only from a Lacanian standpoint. And Bret has been kind enough to give us his time to speak a little bit about that book today. I'll just say a brief word of introduction. Not only is Bret the author of Psychosis in Extreme States, he's also faculty board member and a psychoanalyst of the San Francisco Bay Area in the Lacanian School of Psychoanalysis. And he's also a clinical psychologist, and he works at the Haight-Ashbury Integrated Care Center in San Francisco and also has his own private practice. So Bret, thank you very much for making the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe one way of starting us off would be if you could just give us a brief account of your interest in psychosis, your experience of working with psychotic subjects, and maybe also some thoughts on why psychoanalysis has been a necessary part of that work.
Okay. I guess I always start with that by noting that I think my interest in psychosis sort of preceded my interest in psychoanalysis in any rigorous way. I think I had, going as far back, as maybe even a teenager or college student, an interest in the experience of madness and was looking for ways to understand it that resonated with me. I think I found the explanations by, psychiatry or mainstream psychology or mental health approaches to be pretty lacking. So I kind of made my way through certain authors like Artie Lang and found this to be sort of a more respectful, resonant way of thinking about madness and psychosis. And I didn't go very far with that particular thread, but it was sort of a stepping stone. And I think eventually I found psychoanalysis. I think I began reading Lacan before Freud, really. Not in any particularly focused way in my early 20s, but once I got into training to become a psychologist and could feel that my focus would be on psychosis, I began reading Lacan with a focus on psychosis, given what he had written and said about it. And as an offshoot of that, I became involved with Gifric in Quebec City and sort of their innovations in the field of psychosis. I think they've, I would say that they sort of have reformulated things or a lot of concepts, sort of beginning with the experience of psychosis. That's kind of the way it seemed to me. And not to mention their advances with treatment. So, throughout my training and now beyond, although I work with a range of different types of experiences, people having all kinds of, whether it's neurosis or psychosis or something in between, slowly but surely my, not sole focus, but main focus has become working with people experiencing psychosis proper, in a sense, in terms of the way we speak about it in the Lacanian field, I guess, but also, like the title suggests, extreme states, which may or may not always fit into sort of our diagnostic categories. But I think I'm probably, at the end of it, I find the general term extreme states more inclusive of what I'm interested in. And psychosis being maybe one sort of manifestation of that.
Yeah, that perhaps leads me to another question, and that is to ask you a little bit about the notion of psychotic structure or psychosis as structure. So fairly early on in the book, and I mean, it's a very crucial part of the argument that you advance, you distinguish psychosis as subjective structure from psychotic diagnoses based on symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations. Maybe this is a distinction that is familiar to Lacanians, but it's really, really crucial, and it's very much a platform and foundation for the conceptualization and ethical ideas that you put forward in the book. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by psychosis as structure, and why it is so important to make this distinction between psychosis as structure on the one hand and psychosis as understood via symptoms?
Okay. Well, I think it's distinguishing psychosis as structure. And I'll try to say some things in a kind of pretty practical way about that. I mean, I think there's a theoretical discussion to be had there that is also important, but it's nothing that I can do off the cuff anyway. But so I think to approach the experience of psychosis analytically requires that requires for me anyway, to have a conception of it as having an underlying structure. So, you know, in psychiatry or even behavioral approaches to mental illness and certainly psychosis, there's more of a descriptive approach where phenomenology or in other words, the symptoms are the sole focus. There's no real notion of psychical structure where the symptoms are phenomenology being the voices, maybe so-called delusional thinking, unique or extreme perceptions, that these things that we call symptoms are maybe an expression of or are happening in relation to the structure. But you know, with medication, for example, the goal is to reduce symptoms, to manage symptoms, which is fine. But what if that A doesn't work at all, or only works partially, or creates other problems that are sometimes just as difficult to deal with as distressing voices? So then, you know, I think we need other approaches, and the analytic approach, generally speaking, is one of those. There are several that come from peer models, but also other clinical models. But I'm focused on the analytic model. So, for example, to me, it's interesting to begin to think about listening to psychosis. So listening to voices, listening to delusions, which again, in mainstream mental health in the field, are not generally listened to with an ear for structure or for an ear for meaning or logic. But I think if you listen to someone in these experiences, there's clearly a logic and a structure to the experience. The clinical example I discuss in the book lays this out, I think, fairly well. And Schreber's, you know, that example of a delusion, there's clearly a structure there where the person, you know, the subject has a position, the other has a position, the voices or messages, special messages coming through voices or by other means have a function, maybe are controlled by an omnipotent other, for example. So there is to me, that's not the most important point. And it's not exactly what Lacan is talking about when he talks about psychotic structure. I think he's talking about something maybe preliminary to that or something to the side of that. But it's interesting to me as a clinician that's where you first encounter the structure. There is a structure to the discourse of psychosis. In a way, that's the beginning, I think, of if you want to call it treatment or engagement, is I try to listen, not with a lot of theory in mind, but with that idea in mind, based on experience, my own experience, but also many others, that we first learn, like Lacan said in seminar 3, I think, right, will be secretaries to the insane. It's kind of a harsh statement, but it makes sense, and that's far from all there is to it. But that's always a kind of it speaks to the position of the analyst, but it also speaks to the position of the subject of psychosis within a particular structure, right? That they're going, and then of course gets into how transference might work too, and the reversal of transference, right? So we are going to be the secretary. We're going to learn. We're the student to this person who can teach us through speaking freely about whatever's going on in their body and in their experience and in their world, what's happening to them and how it works. But again, it's only the very beginning, but it's for the successful approaches that I've seen, analytic or otherwise, that's the place to begin. And that's sort of you could say there's an ethics involved there for both sides.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate and emphasize a couple of things that you've said, that phrase that you referred to, this Lacan's idea that analyst might be something akin to the secretary. I was reminded of that by one of the opening chapters of your book, where you utilize and refer to the notion of psychotic as guide. And of course, you've done a similar thing now by, in a way, suggesting that the analyst or the clinician might be, in some respect, a student. Who has indeed a great deal to learn from someone who's experiencing psychosis. So I just wanted to emphasize that, and also to emphasize that because it seems to me that a real crucial feature of the ethics, or of an ethics sensibility that comes across in your book, is one that is always foregrounding the subjectivity, or attempting to foreground the subjectivity of psychotic experience. And that seems to be a crucial part of thinking about psychosis as structure, because in so many other conceptualizations of psychosis, we have a kind of objectivizing tendency. So, I mean, I think that's one of the real achievements of the paradigm you're speaking about generally, but also of the view you put forward in the book. But then, maybe this is an important related point. Towards the end of the book, you also speak about the fear of psychosis. So, I mean, if we were going to say that there's a kind of a tendency to want to treat psychosis as in an objectifying way, to medicate it, to almost in some ways eradicate the symptoms, one of the questions that comes up is the question of delusions. And from a medical point of view, a delusion is a false belief. And it's something, in everyday conceptualization might say, it's something that doesn't correspond with reality. And we can build on that to say, from a medical point of view, a chemical imbalance explains a manic or depressive episode. Now, psychoanalysis takes a very different approach here. How would you describe an analytic relationship to these kinds of symptoms? And in what way is it different from those ideas that I've just put forward about delusion, about the medical treatment of certain symptoms, and so on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of picking up there, and again, like you or anyone, I find myself often being critical of psychology and psychiatry for being reductive, but that's not to say that we don't rely on some of these tools, right? With medication, I believe, has a place. I'm not, as a clinician, against. It's not for me to be against it, actually. It's the choice of the patient, the choice of the subject, of the person, of what they want or need to do. That said, it's a question of ethics, I think. I learned this from studying the approach in Quebec and the 388 and their clinic there, about psychiatry is a big piece of that. But as they always say, it's a question of the ethical relation to the medication. It's not imposed, it's not required. If you don't take it as a method of limiting suffering and symptoms, how are you going to deal with it? That kind of thing. Not to get off on a tangent, but I'm just trying to address sort of the real world, and so that said, I do think it's really problematic the way, again, medicine and psychiatry view the experience of psychosis as, from all that I can tell, at least in terms of the main sort of training there, that these things don't have meaning and function. I think that's the main stance for the analyst, is to assume, if it's delusion, and not everyone is delusional who's experiencing psychosis necessarily, but if it's delusion, that delusion has a function. And the function is to theorize an experience, I would say. So there's two things happening there. It supposes that this subject, this person, maybe in terms of the origin or the break-in of the psychosis, the first episodes, there was an experience of a break-in, of too much, of death drive, as Lacan would say, or there's this experience and this coming in of too much from the other, from the world, and from within, I suppose. And it doesn't, in my experience with people, listening to people, but also that of others, it seems, you know, I think it's interesting that this experience, a kind of originary rupture in the life of the person, doesn't come with the delusion. It doesn't necessarily mean there will be psychosis. A delusion isn't there yet. I think the delusion gets constructed out of necessity and out of, Willie Apollon once said, I'm paraphrasing, but in a lecture that, you know, for some subjects, psychosis is the most economical choice. There's an economy there that requires a kind of choice. You know, it's a specific way of using the word choice, but, you know, how am I going to defend against this too much in the world? Whether that's happening in the family or wherever in the social milieu, right? So already I think there we have a different idea of the function and the purpose of so-called delusion, of belief systems. So for some reason, this person went in this direction and has created a way to explain and give meaning to what was, you know, maybe a nonsensical rupture in their life, in their psychical life. I think the voices are part of that. Maybe the voices in fragments come before delusion as explanation, right? There can be these sort of disconnected signifiers coming in auditory ways, but they're not, you know, spoken by this other or that other. They don't have, they're not personified yet in this all-powerful other, which is often characteristic of, I guess we could say, extraordinary psychosis or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems so important to reiterate that idea that there can be an initial break, which is not the same as the onset of delusions, and that if we are able to keep those two things to emphasize a gap of sorts existing between the two, we're able to understand in I suppose, a good Freudian fashion how the delusion is in many respects a mode of response, even a reparative attempt to respond to a more fundamental break or rupture of sorts.